Hello everyone. Bonjour. Je m'appelle Steve Staples. Je suis le président de l'Institut Rideau. My name is Stephen Staples. I'm the president of the Rideau Institute. And today the Rideau Institute is very pleased to release a new report that for the first time tabulates the number of additional dollars spent on national security since the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. The report is entitled The Cost of 9/11, Tracking the Creation of a National Security Establishment. It was written by economist David MacDonald, who joins me here today. It examines how much the federal government spending on the Department of National Defense, Foreign Affairs, Public Safety, and related agencies has increased in the wake of 9/11 a decade ago. In essence, we've looked at these increases and have concluded that the government has created a national security establishment in Canada. And like all establishments, we should be concerned that they tend to perpetuate themselves long after the need for them is gone. And a decade after 9/11, it's time to reevaluate whether we should be continuing with this very high level of spending on national security, or whether we should be using that money for other urgent priorities. I'm going to now introduce David MacDonald, who is the author of the report, and will provide you with the substance findings, a few remarks in French, and then we'll be glad to take some questions.
Thanks, Steve. Almost a decade ago, Canada and the world were shocked by the events of September 11th, 2001. Canada, like many nations, responded first with moral support, but Canada in particular responded with a long-term commitment in Afghanistan. Our government responded nationally as well, creating entirely new departments and agencies while consolidating others into an entity spanning defense, foreign affairs, domestic security, and justice. Today we are releasing the report, The Cost of 9/11, which itemizes what Canada has spent and will spend from 2001 to the end of this fiscal year in March 2012. And the expense has been dramatic. Over the past decade, Canada has spent almost $92 billion in the areas of defense, foreign affairs, domestic security, and justice. This is over and above what it was spending before 9/11 happened. If this figure is adjusted for inflation, it amounts to $69 billion. The expenditure, while it stretches over a decade, is tremendous and represents a significant opportunity cost for Canadians. Such a dramatic increase in spending has in effect heralded the creation of a de facto national security establishment. A proportion of that $92 billion has been driven by dramatic growth in the military budget, which has almost doubled since 2001. However, what has received much less scrutiny is the growth in security and public safety programs. This sector comprises programs like the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Correctional Services, the RCMP, and CSIS. In terms of the specifics, the budget for Canada's spy agency, CSIS, has tripled. Spending at the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, which did not exist in 2001 in its current form, is up 400%. While we may argue about whether these expenditures made sense in the first 10 years since 9/11, the question today is whether they make sense for the next 10 years. And make no mistake, expenditures of this magnitude could have an immense difference on regular Canadians' lives. $100 billion over the 2000s could have provided all Canadian families with $10 a day childcare, or created national pharmacare, where no Canadian paid for prescription drugs. The situation is different today than it was a decade ago. Osama bin Laden is dead. Canada is wrapping up its mission in Afghanistan, while at the same time unemployment and economic issues are looming larger here at home. Perhaps it is time for the federal government to reevaluate its construction of a national security establishment and consider winding it down. Le Rapport, The Costs of 9/11, estime que le gouvernement fédéral a dépensé près de 92 milliards de dollars depuis septembre 2001 sur la création d'un établissement sécurité nationale couvrant le militaire, sécurité intérieure, justice et les affaires étrangères. Un montant de cette ampleur pourrait avoir essentiellement reconstruit la plupart des systèmes de transport en commun municipaux au Canada ou considérablement diminuer les pressions sur les départements soins de santé provinciaux. La situation est différente aujourd'hui qu'en 2001. Avec Osama Bin Laden mort, la fin d'une mission canadienne en Afghanistan et les difficultés économiques plus importantes ici au Canada. Il est temps de réévaluer ce que le gouvernement devrait soutenir en cet établissement sécurité nationale. Et c'est peut-être temps de commencer à le réduire. Thank you, and we'll take your questions in French as well as in English.
What portion of the Afghanistan costs make up this $92 billion?
The Afghanistan costs would be included in the D&D figure, and so D&D spending is $20 billion, $21 billion this year. The Afghanistan portion of that, depending on how you account for it, I think is $2 or $3 billion. It's a portion of that.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around. You're saying over the next 10 years, if the government continues on this course, they're going to spend another $85 or $87 billion on this security establishment?
Yeah, what's interesting about the study is that the growth, just like a lot of government programs, started small and got dramatically bigger as time went on. So the first couple of years after 2001, the growth was actually quite small in these establishments, and it was only at the end of 2003 with the creation of CBSA and the change in name from Solicitor General to Department of Emergency Preparedness, Public Safety Emergency Preparedness, that things started to accelerate. On the military side, there was a push for increased military spending under the Liberals in the mid-2000s, and so things picked up steam as the decade went on. And so today, if we compared expenditures today compared to 2001, they're about $17 billion bigger, which is dramatic, and that's a yearly figure. So that's a yearly figure we're spending over and above what we spent in 2001. And so it's accelerated. It's not a sort of an even growth where it's $10 billion a year. It's an accelerated growth. And so I think the question today is, with that accelerated growth, is it time to take a look at the acceleration in growth in the military and public and security programs and potentially use some of that money elsewhere on economic growth or reducing the deficit or something like that?
When you talk about an establishment, are you talking about creating like levels of bureaucracy that aren't necessary going forward, and where would you propose, I guess, trying to scale back some of those costs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's happening is that as these particular types of departments become more concentrated, as started to happen in 2003, they start to get more funding and they self-perpetuate. They make arguments for themselves to become bigger. And so one of the concerns looking at the numbers as they expand over time is whether this expansion should continue. And the only way that it's going to stop continuing, I think, is for Canadians to say, we think this money should be spent in a different way. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, I'm just wondering where you would propose cutting back at this point. I mean, are you talking about folding some of these agencies together that have been created, or?
Well, I mean, I think that, CSIS has tripled in size, for instance. Canada Border Services Agency, has tripled in size. So there's been tremendous growth in these agencies. Now, I don't know the specifics of the agencies, but I think that if they could have tripled in size in a decade, certainly there's room to trim them back. On the military side, for instance, despite the fact that we've doubled expenditure since 2001, we're still considering major new capital purchases like the F-35s, for instance. So there's clearly, we've clearly seen, in part to go to your question, we've clearly seen acceleration up to this point. But going forward, we can see that there are new programs coming online, like the F-35s, like the new law and order agenda that will continue to fund this sort of envelope, this establishment going forward.
Je vais poser la même question en français. Où est-ce que vous pensez que le gouvernement devrait couper dans ce sens à partir du rapport?
Oui, alors bien sûr, on a vu beaucoup de croissance dans des différentes zones qu'on a examiné dans notre rapport. L'agence d'espionnage, par exemple, a triplé. Nos dépenses sur le militaire ont doublé depuis 2001. Alors, et quand on regarde à l'avenir, on voit, par exemple, les avions de chasse les F-35, et aussi le nouveau agenda de justice qui va continuer à accélérer les dépenses dans cet établissement.
How do you draw a line between 9/11 and this growth in expenses? What assumptions have you made? I mean, you've given the example of the F-35 or the law and order agenda, which have nothing to do with 9/11.
Well, I mean, I think that what we're doing is we're looking at how much these departments that have argued in part for their growth because of 9/11, how much they've grown in size. And so, the military, one of their big mission for the last decade has been Afghanistan, which was a direct result of 9/11. The safety and security programs, their real creation, I mean, they were actually a bit late to the game. Their real creation started in late 2003 with the renaming of the Solicitor General and the creation of the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, CBSA being split off from Citizenship and Immigration. And these were as a direct result of mirroring what was happening in the U.S. on Homeland Security. And so, I suppose we could argue about whether they would have happened anyway, but I think that there is an argument that part of their justification for their creation role, came out of the 9/11 agenda.
But if only part of their justification came from that, maybe not all of it really is related to 9/11. Maybe some of it is natural budget growth.
Yeah, and so again, we've reported both the absolute figure, the $90 billion, $92 billion, as well as the inflation-adjusted figure. So if you assume these departments, received inflationary increases from their 2001 bases, what would that, what have they spent over and above that? And that figure is $69 billion. So it's still a big number. And so, I think that what we're arguing is that these departments and agencies have grown significantly above inflation. And so it's a question now as to whether their original genesis was 9/11 and they took on a life of their own, whether we should continue spending in these areas or whether we should redirect that money someplace else.
Can you comment on the role of corporate lobbying in building up this security establishment?
That wasn't part of the report particularly, and I'm not sure exactly what role corporations played in building this up, but obviously there's plenty of money to be made in military expenditures. There's plenty of money to be made in terms of new equipment at borders and for CSIS and so on. So there's certainly money to be made, and I'm not sure exactly how much of a role that played in this, but I think it's part of a bigger picture of several agencies coming together, being funded because of a particular event, 9/11, and then sort of taking on a life of their own after that.
Is enough security? It's a very emotional issue. I don't know if you saw the report on the National on CBC yesterday. There are people, Americans, who are very emotional about this, and I presume Canadians are as well. How do you assure people that are worried about their safety?
There's no doubt that security and law and order are emotional issues for Canadians, no doubt about it. What's also an emotional issue is whether you can get prescription drugs for your grandmother, or whether your kids can go to childcare and you can work. And so, I think what this report tries to bring to the table is an actual estimation of the cost of what we're paying for that emotional appeal. And so, yes, this was an incredibly expensive venture. Since 2001, the build up in these various areas, and it is emotionally appealing. But I think that seeing the cost, we hope anyway, will have Canadians think twice about whether it was worth it or whether a more appropriate level should be found in these areas.
You mentioned that bin Laden is dead now, and the Afghanistan mission is winding down, for example, at least the combat part of it.
Yeah.
And you asked whether the expenses make sense over the next decade.
Yeah.
Does that mean that, in your estimation, the war on terror has been a success, that it's mission accomplished, and we can demobilize, as it were?
Well, I mean, I think that the mission in Afghanistan, for instance, that the results are extremely mixed. I think we've got a country that was not in good shape in 2001, and the peace is no more sustainable today than it was in 2001. And despite we certainly spent a fair amount on military expenditures, but we also spent a fair amount in human expenditures. The human cost has been extremely high for Canadian soldiers, and so I'm not sure that, and I think that a lot of people would argue that they're not necessarily sure that Afghanistan is necessarily dramatically better off than it was a decade ago, and so that is, I mean, I think that's a challenge. To say that has been a success, I think whether the war on terror is a success or not, I think is a moot point at this juncture. The times have changed since 2001. It's not about a global war on terrorism. It's about a global economic crisis, and that's what we're facing today, as opposed to what we were facing perhaps in 2001. And so I'm not necessarily arguing that we should change the way we spend money that's been spent. The money has been spent. I think the question is, should we change how we're going to spend the money in the future? And that's the open question here.
But is the assumption that the world is safer today, or is the conclusion that the world is safer today than it was in 2001?
I think that I mean, the report doesn't conclude that. I think the world is different today than it was in 2001. And so I'm not sure that the mission in Afghanistan, we can claim success or failure necessarily. It certainly is not an unabashed success, I think, as anyone would admit. And so I think that the challenge going forward is not to say, it was good or it was bad or we won or we didn't win, but that we spent a lot of money on it. Should we continue to keep spending this level of money on it when the situation has changed?
Are you suggesting that the spending on security has been disproportionate compared with other priorities, or are you suggesting that there's been wasteful or inappropriate spending?
Well, David's report did not look at it's not like an Auditor General's report that looked at benchmarks and then said if the spending was appropriate or not. It's a very aggregate type of look at it. But it's clear that when you look in a paper like this and you look at the amount of military spending that's in it, for instance, and the incredible amount of equipment, and I think there's certainly clear signs that there's been defense equipment expenditures that were not necessary, that were redundant in some ways, that were ill-conceived, that were rushed at a particular moment, and then in hindsight perhaps was not needed. So I think that in any kind of experience, when you see that kind of rapid increase in spending, there's going to be waste. There's going to be mistakes made. There's going to be a loss of some efficiencies there. So I think there's room definitely to be found in that.
What military spending are you talking about? Like which are the wasteful or the
Sure.
misconceived ones?
Well, I think there's definite questions around certainly some of the helicopter programs that the Auditor General has looked at. I think the submarine program is a definite red herring and should be let go. I think there are serious questions around why we bought 2 fleets of transport aircraft instead of focusing on one, either a long-range strategic lift or renewed shorter-range tactical airlift. I'm talking about the C-130Js versus the C-17s, and we all know that those purchases were the result of what was largely a political disagreement between 2 powerful figures in government. And so there was so much money available, they bought both, 2 fleets. And I think that's when you look at the situation. I think we look at tanks, for instance. You can look at the Leopard 2s. There was a need maybe for 20 in Afghanistan. We bought 120. And that's because there was just so much money flowing into national defense, which is an area that I have more